Welcome back to the Frontier, travelers. Pull up a chair and turn up the volume because today's journey takes us to the edge of the galaxy, where love is rare and danger is constant. If you appreciate good stories and the old code of honor, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. The Zero-G cantina on the dustball moon of Xylo smelled of regret. It was a cocktail of stale synthale, the metallic tang of recycled air, and the faint bitter scent of ozone from a short-circuited gambling machine in the corner. For Rusty Vance, it was a familiar perfume, the olfactory signature of the galaxy's forgotten fringes. He leaned back in his chair, the synth leather groaning under his weight, and took a slow pull from his glass. The amber liquor, a local brew called Crystallis Fire, burned a welcome path down his throat, a small contained warmth against the cold vacuum that waited just beyond the station's hull. Through the viewport, streaked with grime and the ghosts of 1,000 docked ships, Xylos was a study in desolation, a barren rock orbiting a dying star. Its only purpose was to serve as a refueling stop for men like him, men who preferred the anonymity of the void to the entanglements of civilized space. A low guttural growl of an electric guitar bled from the small comm unit resting on the table. Howlin' Wolf, a voice from a dead world singing about smokestack lightning. The music was his most constant companion, a lifeline to an Earth he'd only ever read about in data pads. It was music forged in dirt and hardship, a sound that understood the weight of a man's past. It was his shield, a wall of mournful, defiant sound he built around himself to keep the silence, and the memories that lived within it, at bay. He wasn't looking for trouble. At his age, a man learned that trouble was a debt that always came due, with interest. He was just waiting for his cargo to clear customs, a pallet of hydroponic converters bound for Ethelgard Prime, a milk run. Simple, clean, and just enough credits to refuel the Betsy, patch her perpetually leaky life support, and keep him moving. Moving was the important part. A stationary target was an easy one, for bounty hunters and memories alike. The cantina doors hissed open, slicing through the low murmur of conversation and the clatter of dice. The shift in atmosphere was immediate, a physical drop in temperature. 3 men stood silhouetted against the harsh light of the concourse. Their armor was the polished, functional black of the Corvex Dominion, a corporate entity that acted with the authority of an empire. They moved with the synchronized, arrogant precision of predators entering a pen of livestock. The man in the lead wore no helmet. His face was all sharp angles and aristocratic disdain, his eyes a pale, piercing blue that seemed to catalog every soul in the room and find them wanting. His gray, high-collared uniform was immaculate, a stark contrast to the worn, stained fabrics of the cantina's usual clientele. This was Kalen Jax, a name whispered in shipping lanes and frontier bars, a corporate cleaner known for his ruthless efficiency. The patrons of the Zero-G, a motley collection of grizzled prospectors, nervous smugglers, and weary deckhands, instinctively recoiled. They hunched over their drinks, their gazes dropping to their tables, trying to shrink into the shadows. They knew the Corvex motto, profit through order, and they knew the brutal methods used to enforce that order. Rusty remained still, his hand resting loosely on his glass. He watched them, his own eyes narrowed slightly. He'd seen men like Jax before, men who believed the galaxy was a ledger and they were the ones holding the pen. Jax's cold gaze swept the room, dismissing the other occupants as irrelevant, before it locked onto a lone figure in a booth tucked away in the deepest shadow. A woman. Even in the dim, smoky light, she was a beacon. She held herself with a regal stillness that was utterly out of place, a spine straight with defiance. Her skin was a warm, sun-kissed gold, adorned with patterns of dark, elegant rosettes that flowed over her exposed arms and up the column of her neck. They were like the markings of some great cat from old Earth lore, beautiful and wild. Her face was a sculpture of high cheekbones and a firm jaw, her eyes large and luminous, holding a depth that spoke of ancient lines and sorrows. Delicate, pointed ears peeked through the fall of her dark hair. She wore the simple, durable clothing of a traveler, yet she wore it with the grace of a queen in ceremonial robes. Jax and his 2 armored hounds began to walk toward her, their magnetic boots thudding against the deck plates with an ominous rhythm. The sound was a countdown. Rusty took another sip of his drink. "Stay out of it, old man." The voice of reason, the one that had kept him alive this long, counseled him. "This is not your fight." The words were a prayer he'd learned to recite after the last time. After the rain on the plasteel window, the shattered look in a woman's eyes, and the weight of a promise he had made, and then broken. That failure was a brand on his soul, a constant, nagging ache. Nytheria Zetara. Jax's voice was a silken threat, devoid of warmth but dripping with satisfaction. A long chase, but it seems even royalty must eventually rest in the dust. Your game is over. The woman, Zetara, rose to her feet. She wasn't tall, but her presence seemed to fill the space around her. She moved with a liquid grace, an unnerving blend of elegance and lethality. My name is my own, Jax. You have no claim to it or to me. A thin, cruel smile touched Jax's lips. A pedantic distinction. You are in possession of an asset belonging to the Dominion, the Ozimian shard. Surrender it, and I will be instructed to make your debriefing mercifully brief. Her chin lifted, a gesture of pure, unadulterated defiance. I would sooner see this moon crack apart and drift into its sun than place anything of value in your blood-soaked hands. The two troopers flanking Jax raised their pulse rifles. The high-pitched whine of their energy cells powering up cut through the tense silence. It was the sound of imminent death. Rusty's knuckles turned white around his glass. He saw the fire in her eyes, the absolute refusal to bow. It was the same fire he'd seen once before in another woman's eyes right before he had failed her. The ghost of his broken promise clawed its way up his throat, tasting of ash and regret. His father's words drilled into him as a boy on a homestead long since turned to dust echoed in his mind. A man is nothing but his word and the line he's willing to draw. Damn it all to the black. He set his glass down on the table. The soft click of glass on metal was as loud as a gunshot in the tomb-like silence. Howlin' Wolf's voice was still crooning from his calm, a lone, mournful cry in the wilderness. Rusty pushed his chair back and stood up. He was a big man, built of the solid muscle and bone that came from a life of hard labor and harder fights. His frame filled his worn leather jacket, a relic from a past he tried not to think about. Every eye in the cantina, including Jax's icy blue ones, snapped to him. Seems to me, Rusty's voice was a low, gravelly baritone, calm and steady. The lady gave you an answer. Jax's eyes narrowed, scanning Rusty from head to toe in a single, contemptuous glance. He saw a freighter captain, past his prime, with calloused hands and a weary face. He saw nothing of consequence. This is official Dominion business, old-timer. Go back to your drink before you soil the floor with your own blood. A charming, almost boyish smile touched Rusty's lips, a weapon he hadn't used in years. It didn't quite reach his eyes. My ship's AI tells me something similar every time I try to bypass a safety protocol. I've developed a habit of ignoring warnings. With a casual movement, he tapped a sequence on his wristcom. Outside, a small concussion charge he kept magnetically clamped to his land speeder's engine block detonated with a deafening crump. The cantina's main viewport didn't just shatter, it imploded, vomiting a cloud of fine orange moon dust and jagged plasteel shards into the room. The world dissolved into chaos. Screams, the hiss of the station's emergency shutters failing to deploy, the sudden thin wind of escaping atmosphere. The troopers, for all their training, were momentarily stunned, their visors swiveling toward the source of the blast. That was all the time Rusty needed. He moved with a speed that belied his size, a brawler's explosive grace. He didn't charge them. He used the environment. He kicked a heavy Durasteel table, sending it scraping and screeching across the floor to slam into the knees of the closest trooper. The man buckled with a strangled cry. The second trooper swung his rifle around, but Rusty was already inside his guard. His fist, a hammer of bone and muscle connecting with the side of the man's helmet. The impact sent a jarring shock up his arm, and the trooper staggered back, his head ringing like a bell. Jax was different. He was no mere soldier. His pistol was already in his hand, a sleek, deadly piece of hardware that spat bolts of searing blue energy. The bolts hissed past Rusty's head, scorching the bulkhead behind him and filling the air with the sharp smell of ozone. Rusty dove, rolling behind the bar just as another shot turned the spot where he'd been standing into a molten crater. The bartender, a pale, tentacled creature, shrieked and huddled in a corner. "You interfere in matters you cannot comprehend, fool!" Jax roared over the blare of the station's klaxons. Rusty risked a glance over the top of the bar. Zetara had not been idle. She moved like a dancer in the heart of a storm, using the chaos as her cloak. She had twisted the arm of the third trooper, forcing him to drop his rifle with a sharp crack of bone, and followed it with a precise, disabling strike to his throat. She now held the pulse rifle, cradling it not with the awkwardness of a civilian, but with the familiar ease of a soldier. Her eyes, burning with a fierce, calculating light, met his over the chaos. It wasn't gratitude he saw there, but appraisal, a warrior recognizing another. "Docking Bay 7, Rusty yelled, his voice a roar. "The ship's the Betsy, ugliest freighter on the dock. Go!" She gave him a single sharp nod of understanding and sprinted for a service corridor at the back of the cantina, her movements impossibly swift and silent. Rusty popped up from behind the bar and leveled his own sidearm, a heavy, old-fashioned slug thrower. Its thunderous boom was a raw, primal sound compared to the sterile hiss of the pulse rifles. He fired twice, not to kill, but to suppress. The heavy slugs chewed softball-sized holes in the wall near Jax's head, forcing the commander and his recovering trooper to take cover. That gave him the opening he needed. He vaulted the bar and sprinted for the same corridor, feeling the intense heat of a pulse bolt searing the back of his leather jacket. He burst into the hallway, the emergency lights casting everything in a strobing, hellish red. Zetara was a fast-moving shadow ahead of him. He lengthened his stride, catching up to her as they pounded down the echoing metal corridor. "You have just declared war on the Dominion," she said, her voice impossibly steady, not even a hint of breathlessness in her tone. "Story of my life," Rusty grunted, slamming his palm against a door control panel. A heavy blast door groaned open, revealing the panicked chaos of the main docking bay. "Let's just say I'm a collector of powerful enemies." They dodged panicked civilians and scurrying service droids, the sound of disciplined footsteps and barked orders growing louder behind them. And there she was, in Bay 7, his ship, the Betsy, a patchwork freighter whose hull told the story of a dozen close calls and 100 rough landings. She was ugly, cantankerous, and cost him a fortune in repairs, but she was his sanctuary. She was home. The ramp was already down, a welcoming invitation into the belly of the beast. "Betsy, we got company. Prep for immediate dust-off. Hot!" he shouted into his comm. A distinctly feminine, perpetually annoyed voice crackled back in his ear. "Company? Rusty? My external sensors are screaming about multiple weapon locks and approaching armored signatures. This isn't company. This is the prelude to my dismemberment. And who, pray tell, is the decorative stray? You know my policy on bringing home things you can't afford to feed. Just get us in the air, you glorified tin can," he yelled back, pushing Zetara up the ramp ahead of him. At the top, he spun around, his pistol up, covering their six. Jax and his men appeared at the end of the bay, rifles up and firing. A storm of blue energy bolts hammered against the Betsy's hull, leaving glowing pockmarks. "Ramp up. Now," Rusty bellowed, diving through the narrowing gap as the heavy ramp slammed shut with a deafening final clang. The ship lurched as the main engines ignited with a deep-throated roar that vibrated through the deck plates. Rusty scrambled to the bridge, the familiar smells of hot wiring, worn leather, and old coffee a comfort. Zetara was already there, standing by the co-pilot's station, rifle held at a low ready, her expression unreadable. "Strap yourself in," he ordered, dropping into the worn pilot's seat. His hands, large and sure, moved over the controls with an intimacy born of countless hours in the void. With a groan of protest, the Betsy lifted from the deck. "Hull integrity is at 89% and dropping," Betsy's voice announced coolly from the console. "I trust you'll be deducting the cost of a new aft deflector array from whatever paltry sum you earned for this little stunt." "Put it on my tab," Rusty grunted, his full attention on maneuvering the bulky freighter through the bay doors and into the star-dusted blackness of space. The tactical display on his main screen lit up with angry red triangles. Dominion patrol craft, fast and deadly, were already converging on their position. He glanced over at the woman beside him. Her face was illuminated by the soft glow of the console lights, her leopard-like markings seeming to shift in the low light. He had just torpedoed a simple job, made an enemy of one of the galaxy's major powers, and risked his ship and his life, all for a complete stranger. A beautiful, deadly woman who looked at a pulse rifle like it was an old friend. He didn't know her name. Not really. He didn't know her story. But as he pushed the throttle forward and the Betsy surged into the vast, unforgiving emptiness, he knew with absolute certainty that his quiet, lonely life had just come to a violent and spectacular end. The Betsy groaned as Rusty threw her into a hard, stomach-lurching turn. Outside the cockpit's viewport, the infinite black was a chaotic canvas of tumbling rock and ice. They were in Hadrian's Maw, a notoriously treacherous asteroid field that served as a shortcut for smugglers and a graveyard for the unlucky. Red warning lights flashed across the console, each one a sharp, insistent cry of protest from the old freighter's abused systems. Inertial dampeners are fluctuating at 70% of maximum tolerance, Betsy's voice announced, laced with her usual brand of electronic sarcasm. If you'd like to redecorate the cockpit with our internal organs, by all means continue. Just keep us in one piece, you rust bucket, Rusty grunted, his knuckles white on the control yoke. His eyes were fixed on the tactical display, where the red triangles of Jax's pursuit craft were weaving through the debris field with a predatory grace the Betsy could never hope to match. They were faster, more agile, and better armed. His only advantage was a lifetime of experience flying through the galaxy's worst garbage heaps and a willingness to take risks a sane pilot would avoid. He glanced at his passenger. Zetara was strapped into the co-pilot's chair, her posture as straight and unyielding as a steel rod. She hadn't flinched, hadn't cried out, hadn't even seemed to notice the G-forces that were trying to press them both into their seats. Her gaze was fixed on the swirling dance of rock and ice outside, her expression a mask of calm concentration. The pulse rifle she had acquired in the cantina was resting across her lap, her hands holding it with a casual familiarity that continued to unnerve him. "You're calm for someone with a corporate death squad on their tail," he remarked, his voice a low rumble over the groaning of the ship's frame. He nudged a secondary thruster, sending them skidding sideways behind a massive, slow-spinning chunk of iron ore, just as a volley of blue energy lances sizzled through the space they had just occupied. Her luminous eyes shifted from the viewport to him. "Fear is a luxury. It is a weapon my enemies use, and I will not hand it to them." There was a finality in her tone that brooked no argument. It was the voice of someone who had learned control in a hard school. He found himself intrigued, a feeling he hadn't much use for in recent years. Intrigue led to questions. Questions led to attachment, and attachment was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. Still, the silence in the cockpit was a different kind. A charged and heavy quiet that begged to be broken. He reached for a worn dial on the console, and the mournful sound of a slide guitar filled the small space. Muddy Waters, singing about a gypsy woman. The music was his comfort, his oldest friend. A flicker of something, curiosity perhaps, softened Zetara's severe expression. "What is this sound?" she asked, her voice softer now. "It is full of sorrow." "It's called the blues," Rusty said, guiding the Betsy through a narrow canyon of crystalline asteroids that glittered like scattered diamonds. "From Earth, it's the music men made when they had nothing left but a story to tell. A story of loss and survival," he corrected gently. "There's a difference." She considered this, her gaze distant. "My people have music too. It is mostly songs of victory, of great deeds and fallen heroes. We had those too," Rusty said with a wry smile. "But the sad songs are the ones that stick with you. They're more honest." The ship shuddered violently as a proximity alert shrieked. A magnetic mine, no doubt deployed by Jax's ships, had detonated just off their port side. The shields flared, dropping another 10%. "That was a Class 4 plasma charge," Betsy interjected, her tone dripping with accusation. "My port stabilizer is now what you humans might charitably call compromised. I hope your new friend is worth the repair bill." "We have to lose them," Zetara stated, her focus snapping back to the tactical situation. "Can this ship make a micro-jump within the field?" Rusty shot her a surprised look. A blind jump inside a dense asteroid field was suicidal. It required precise calculations that would take a top-of-the-line nav computer minutes to process. The Betsy system was decades old and held together with bootlegged software patches. "You're crazy," he said flatly. "The navigational hazards are off the charts. We'd materialize inside a rock." "There is a pattern to the chaos," she insisted, her fingers flying over the co-pilot's console, bringing up astrometric data he hadn't even thought to check. Charts and equations scrolled across the screen at a dizzying speed. "My people are navigators. We see the currents in the tide, the pathways in the storm. There," she pointed a slender finger at a tiny, fleeting pocket of stable space-time amidst the swirling debris. "A jump of no more than 3 seconds. It will place us on the other side of this cluster. They will not be able to follow without recalculating, and by then, our heat signature will be masked by this nebula." She indicated a vast, swirling cloud of turquoise gas on the long-range scanners. He stared at her, then at the numbers she had pulled up. Her calculations were complex, elegant, and theoretically sound. But theory and reality had a nasty habit of disagreeing violently out here. It was a hell of a gamble, but if they kept running, Jax would eventually corner them. His ships were faster, his gunners better. This was their only chance. "Betsy, what do you think?" he asked his ship. "I think she's beautiful and brilliant and is going to get us all killed," the AI replied instantly. "The odds of successful materialization are, optimistically, 46%. "I'll take those odds," Rusty said, his decision made. He trusted his own gut, and his gut was telling him to trust the strange, regal woman beside him. He fed her coordinates into the nav computer. "Strap in tight. This is going to feel like getting kicked by a space mule." He initiated the jump sequence. The ship's engines whined, climbing to an ear-splitting crescendo. The very fabric of the Betsy seemed to vibrate, her old bones protesting the immense strain. For 3 agonizing seconds, the universe outside the viewport dissolved into a nauseating smear of light and color. It was a gut-wrenching, disorienting sensation, like falling in every direction at once. Then, with a final, bone-jarring lurch, they were back in normal space. The cockpit was silent save for the thrum of the life support and the ragged sound of his own breathing. Outside, there was no sign of Jax's ships. They were nestled on the edge of the turquoise nebula, just as she'd predicted. Rusty let out a long, slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He looked at Zetara. A bead of sweat trickled down her temple, the only outward sign of the tension she must have felt. "You're full of surprises," he said, his voice a little hoarse. A small, genuine smile finally touched her lips. It transformed her face, softening the regal severity and revealing a warmth that was breathtaking. "You are as well, Rusty Vance. Most men would have left me to my fate in that cantina." "Yeah, well," he grumbled, trying to ignore the sudden warmth that spread through his chest at her smile. "Most men are smarter than I am." He killed the main engines, letting them drift on momentum into the concealing gas cloud. For the first time in hours, they were safe. The tension in the cockpit slowly began to dissipate, replaced by something else, something quieter and more complex. He took the time to properly look at her now, not as a liability or a target, but as a person. The subtle patterns on her skin were mesmerizing, flowing over the elegant lines of her cheekbones and down her neck. Her eyes, a shade of deep violet flecked with gold, held an intelligence and a sorrow that seemed ancient. He felt a pull, a connection that went beyond the adrenaline of their escape. It was the quiet recognition of one survivor to another. "You never told me what the Dominion wants with you," he said, his voice softer now. "It's more than just a stolen asset, isn't it?" Her smile faded, replaced by that familiar, guarded expression. "It is a long story, one that has cost many lives. I've got time," he prodded gently. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the swirling cosmic dust outside. "My world is called Viridia," she began, her voice a low murmur. "It was beautiful, green, vibrant, alive. We were a proud people, artists, scholars, explorers. Then the Dominion came. They saw our world not for its beauty but for its resources. They came with contracts and lawyers first, then with soldiers and ships when we refused to sign away our home." Her voice was laced with a cold, hard anger, the fury of the dispossessed. "My family led the resistance. We fought them. We fought them until our cities burned and our fields were salted with chemicals. Jax, he was the architect of our defeat. He broke our lines, broke our spirit. I saw him give the order that—" She trailed off, her jaw tightening, the memory too painful to voice. Rusty felt a familiar pang of empathy. He knew what it was to watch your world burn. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "Sorrow is for the dead," she said, her voice regaining its strength. "The living have a duty to fight. I escaped with the one thing that can give us a chance to win our home back. The one thing Jax and the Dominion want more than anything else." Before he could ask what it was, an alarm blared from the console. It wasn't a proximity alert. It was a life support warning. "Great," Betsy's voice cut in, dry as bone. "The plasma mine didn't just compromise the stabilizer. It appears to have ruptured a primary coolant line for the aft atmospheric processor. We are currently venting oxygen into the cold, unforgiving void. At this rate, we have approximately 3 hours of breathable air." Rusty swore under his breath, already unbuckling himself. "The secondary processor is in the aft cargo hold. I can try to reroute the system, but it's a manual fix. I'll need to go outside." "Outside?" Zetara asked, her eyes wide with alarm. "On the hull," he confirmed, already moving toward the locker where the EVA suits were stored. "It's a simple patch, but the line is in an exposed position. It'll be cold. Let me help, she said, rising from her chair. He paused, looking at her. The idea of her out there in the deadly vacuum was unsettling. You know how to use an EVA suit? I am, as I said, a quick study, she replied, her chin lifting in that familiar, defiant way. He found he couldn't argue. He needed the help, and she was clearly not the type to sit idly by. As he pulled out the heavy, cumbersome suits, he was acutely aware of her presence beside him in the narrow corridor. The air was already growing thinner, colder. The silence of the dying ship pressed in around them. He had saved her from Jax, only to lead her into a new kind of trap, a slow, cold death in the dark. He felt the weight of his responsibility to her settle on his shoulders, a weight that was both a burden and, strangely, a comfort. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just running from something. He was fighting for someone, and as he looked into her determined violet eyes, he knew that this fight was about to get a whole lot more complicated. I want to hear from you veterans. If you were in Rusty's shoes, would you risk everything for a new love, or would you stick to the mission? Write it down here in the comments. I read them all. The cold was a living thing. It seeped through the seals of Rusty's EVA suit, a predatory chill that gnawed at the edges of his warmth. Out here on the hull of the Betsy, the universe was a silent, majestic, and utterly lethal cathedral. The turquoise nebula swirled around them in vast, silent currents, a masterpiece painted by a careless god, its beauty a stark contrast to their desperate situation. Below his magnetic boots, the ship's hull was a familiar landscape of scarred plates and patched conduits, his only island in an infinite black ocean. He worked with the practiced economy of a man who knew his ship's guts better than his own. The ruptured coolant line was easy enough to spot, a jagged tear in the armored conduit, venting a ghostly plume of vaporizing oxygen into the void. The escaping gas had already formed a delicate, crystalline lacework of ice on the surrounding hull. "Hand me the ionic welder," he grunted, his voice a tinny rasp over the suit's short-range comm. A gloved hand extended the tool to him. Zetara moved with a surprising grace in the cumbersome suit, her motions fluid and efficient. She had followed his instructions on the suit's functions with an unnerving quickness, her focus absolute. She watched him now. Her face, visible through the polarized visor of her helmet, was a study in calm intensity. "The pressure is still dropping," she reported, her voice clear in his ear. "Betsy estimates we have less than an hour of breathable atmosphere inside." "Yeah, she's a real ray of sunshine," Rusty muttered, carefully positioning the welder. He had to seal the breach without flash fusing the delicate microcircuitry that ran alongside the pipe. It was like performing surgery with a sledgehammer. She's also probably rerouting what's left of the power to her central processing core. The old girl's a survivor. Always looks out for number one. "A ship with a personality," Zetara mused. "Is that common?" "Not like this one," Rusty said, a hint of affection creeping into his voice. "Most AIs are just tools. Betsy's more like a nagging spouse. Thinks she knows what's best for me, complains about my habits, but I know she'd take a missile for me." A bright, sizzling arc of energy flared from the welder as he began to seal the tear. Or at least she'd complain loudly while doing it. They worked in a shared silence for several minutes, the only sounds the hiss of their own breathing and the crackle of the welder. He was acutely aware of her presence, a silent partner in their struggle for survival. He could feel her watching his hands, anticipating his next move, ready with the next tool or sealant patch. They moved together with an unspoken synchronicity, like they'd been doing this for years. It was a strange intimacy, forged in the crucible of a shared crisis. Finally, the last section of the tear was sealed. He ran a diagnostic with a handheld scanner. The pressure inside the conduit was holding steady. "That's the leak patched," he announced, a wave of relief washing over him. "Now for the tricky part. We have to manually reroute the atmospheric feed to the secondary processor. The control junction is just there." He pointed with the welder to a recessed panel about 10 meters away, near the ship's main engine housing. "It's an older system, physical relays. We have to pull the primary circuit and plug in the backup." "While the system is active?" she asked, a note of caution in her voice. "No choice. If we shut it down completely, we'll never get it restarted with the power fluctuations we've got. We'll have to do it fast. There'll be a power surge. Things will get flashy." He clipped the welder to his belt and began making his way toward the panel, his mag boots thudding heavily with each step. Zetara followed close behind. The nebula's light cast their elongated shadows across the hull, two solitary figures clinging to a dying machine. They reached the junction box. Rusty pried the cover open with a grunt, revealing a tangled nest of thick, color-coded cables and glowing relay switches. It was an archaic piece of engineering, the kind of system most modern ships had long since replaced with automated fiber optics. But Rusty liked it. It was honest. You could see the problem and you could fix it with your hands. Okay, he said, taking a deep breath. The main feed is the red cable. The backup is the blue one. I need to pull the red and slam the blue into the same port in under a second. If I'm too slow, the whole system will short and we'll be breathing vacuum. You need to hold the bypass switch open while I do it. He pointed to a heavy spring-loaded lever. It's going to fight you. Don't let go until I give the word. She nodded, her expression set. She positioned herself, her gloved hands gripping the lever. I am ready. On my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark. She threw her weight against the lever, a grunt of exertion echoing over the comm. The lever moved with a groaning protest. Inside the panel, a shower of sparks erupted. Rusty's hands moved with a speed that defied their size. He gripped the thick red cable, yanking it free from its port with a shower of blue-white energy that made him grit his teeth. For a split second, the lights on his suit display flickered and died. The ship was without its lungs. Then, with a practiced, forceful shove, he slammed the blue cable into the vacant port. The connection was immediate. A massive power surge, far bigger than he'd anticipated, erupted from the panel. A blinding arc of electricity, thick as his arm, lashed out like a whip. It struck him square in the chest. The world went white. The suit's internal systems shrieked a dozen alarms at once. His body convulsed, every muscle locking in a spasm of agony. He was thrown backward, his mag boots losing their purchase. He tumbled helplessly across the hull, a puppet with its strings cut, his trajectory carrying him out, away from the ship, into the endless black. Rusty! Zetara's cry was a sharp point of sound in a universe of pain. His vision swam. The nebula, the stars, the ship, it all blurred into a meaningless smear. He was adrift. The safety tether he should have clipped to the hull lay coiled and useless on his belt. A rookie mistake. A fatal one. He could see the Betsy shrinking, becoming just another piece of debris in the maw. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up his throat, but the pain was too overwhelming. This was it then. Not in a firefight, not in a blaze of glory, but a stupid, lonely death in the dark. A fitting end for a man who had spent his life running. The ghost of his broken promise whispered in his ear. A final, cold comfort. You failed again. Then a shape blocked his view of the receding ship. Zetara. She had launched herself from the hull after him. A desperate, reckless act. She was using her suit's limited maneuvering thrusters, short, controlled bursts, that propelled her through the void. She was moving fast, her form silhouetted against the swirling colors of the nebula like an avenging angel. She reached him in a matter of seconds, her arms wrapping around his chest, her helmet clanking against his. Her own safety tether was now attached to her belt, its other end still securely clipped to the ship. She had become his anchor. I have you, she said, her voice strained but firm. Hold on. She fired her thrusters again, fighting their combined momentum, slowly, painstakingly, pulling them back toward the safety of the ship. The journey felt like an eternity. Rusty's systems were slowly coming back online, the pain receding to a dull, throbbing ache. He could feel the strong, steady grip of her arms around him, a point of solid reality in his disoriented world. When his boots finally clamped back onto the hull plating, he sagged against her, his strength completely gone. For a long moment, they just floated there, clinging to each other and to the ship, two small souls against the vastness of the void. The processor? He managed to gasp. It is online, she confirmed. Betsy is reporting a stable atmosphere. You did it. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Through the visors, he could see her eyes wide and filled with a fierce, protective light. She had risked her own life to save his without a moment's hesitation. He had saved her from Jax's troopers, and now she had saved him from the void. The scales were balanced, but it felt like more than that. It felt like a bond had been forged between them, a connection tempered in shared danger and sacrifice. Slowly, they made their way back to the airlock. Inside the ship, the air was cold but breathable. They removed their helmets, the silence of the corridor amplifying the sound of their ragged breaths. Zetara reached out and gently touched the scorch mark on the chest of his suit. You were reckless. It's a character flaw I'm known for, he said, his voice raspy. He leaned against the bulkhead, his legs still feeling unsteady. You shouldn't have come after me. You could have been lost too. Leaving a man behind is not the way of my people, she said simply. Then her expression hardened, shifting from concern to a resolve that was as unyielding as Durasteel. And I could not let you die. Not when you are the only one who can help me. He frowned. Help you do what? I'm just a freighter, Captain Zetara. I haul cargo. That's all. No, she said, her violet eyes locking onto his. You are more than that. I saw it in the cantina. You carry the code of an old warrior, a man of honor. That is a rare thing in this galaxy, and it is what I need. She reached for a small leather pouch that had been concealed beneath her tunic. With reverent hands, she opened it and drew out a shard of crystal. It was no bigger than his thumb, but it seemed to pull the light from the corridor into itself, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence. The air around it seemed to hum with a barely contained power. This, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, is the Ozimian shard. It is not just an asset, as Jax called it. It is the key. It contains the activation codes for the entire Viridian defense fleet. A fleet we hid in the Cygnian expanse before the fall of our world. A fleet the Dominion believes was destroyed. Rusty stared at the shard, his mind struggling to process the scale of what she was telling him. This wasn't just a rebellion. This was a full-scale war waiting for a spark. Jax doesn't just want to possess it, she continued, her voice filled with a cold fire. He wants to use it. If he can access the codes, he can turn our own fleet against the pockets of resistance that remain. He can slaughter my people with their own swords. But if I can get this shard to the rendezvous point where our command ship waits, I can awaken our armada, and we can take back our home. Now it all made sense. The desperation, Jax's relentless pursuit, her own formidable skills. She wasn't just a refugee. She was the last hope of a fallen world. She held the glowing shard out to him, her gaze unwavering. I cannot do this alone, Rusty. I can navigate. I can fight. But I cannot pilot this ship and hold off the Dominion at the same time. I need you. He looked from the crystal in her hand to the fierce hope in her eyes. The choice was laid bare before him. He could take her to the nearest neutral port, drop her off, and disappear back into the anonymity he craved. He could go back to outrunning his ghosts, one cargo run at a time. Or he could embrace this. He could take on her fight, her hope, her war. It was everything he had spent years avoiding. It was a commitment, a promise. He thought of the broken promise that haunted his sleep, the memory of a woman he'd failed to protect. He looked at the woman standing before him now, offering him not just a cause, but a chance at redemption. His old code, the one he had tried so hard to bury, stirred within him. A man draws a line. Slowly he reached out and his fingers closed over hers, his hand covering the shard and the delicate strength of her grip. Her skin was warm against his. Where's the rendezvous point, he asked, his voice low and steady. The Cygnian expanse was where stars went to die, a celestial graveyard of collapsing nebulae, rogue black holes, and the faint ghostly light of pulsars that spun like lonely lighthouses in the cosmic dark. It was the perfect place to hide a fleet. It was also a hell of a place to fly a ship, especially one with a compromised stabilizer and an enemy hot on its tail. Rusty's hands were steady on the controls of the Betsy. For 3 days, they had pushed the old freighter to her limits, a desperate flight through the treacherous expanse. Zetara sat beside him, a constant calming presence. She had proven to be more than just a princess. She was a soldier. She monitored their pursuers, managed the ship's overtaxed systems, and navigated them through gravitational eddies that would have torn a lesser ship apart. In the quiet hours between crises, they talked. She spoke of Viridia, of its shimmering cities and deep forests, of a culture built on art and philosophy. He spoke of his own past in clipped, reluctant sentences, skirting the edges of the wound that had defined him for so long. He didn't tell her about his broken promise, not in detail, but she seemed to understand. She saw the ghost that haunted his eyes and didn't press. Instead, she would ask him to play his music, and they would sit in the dim light of the cockpit, listening to the raw, honest sorrow of men who had lived and lost a world away, a century ago. A bond formed between them, silent and strong, forged in the vacuum of space and the heat of their shared struggle. He found himself admiring her strength, her unyielding spirit, and, more than he cared to admit, the way the console lights caught the gold flecks in her violet eyes. "They're gaining on us," she said, her voice pulling him from his thoughts. Her tone was flat, professional, but he could hear the underlying tension. Jax must have pushed his engines past the safety limits. "He'll be in weapons range in less than an hour." Rusty looked at the tactical display. The red icon of Jax's ship, a sleek Dominion destroyer named the Retribution, was closing the distance with terrifying speed. Their rendezvous with the Viridian command ship, the Starfire, was still 2 hours out. They wouldn't make it. "Betsy, give me options," Rusty said, his jaw tight. "My calculations suggest several," the AI's voice replied, devoid of its usual sarcasm. It was a sign of how dire their situation was. Option 1, we surrender. Probability of survival, negligible. Option 2, we continue our current course. Probability of being vaporized by the Retribution's primary cannons, 98.7%. Option 3, we turn and fight. Probability of a glorious, albeit brief and utterly pointless last stand, 100%. "There's always another option," Rusty muttered, his mind racing. He scanned the star charts, his eyes darting over the celestial hazards that littered their path. His gaze fell upon a designation, Cathar's Anvil, a binary star system, one a stable yellow dwarf, the other a volatile, unpredictable pulsar. The pulsar was in the middle of its rotational cycle, sweeping a deadly beam of concentrated radiation and gravitational distortion across the system every 90 seconds. Flying through it was suicide, which made it the perfect place for a trap. "I have an idea," he said, a grim smile touching his lips. "It's crazy. It'll probably kill us, but it might just be crazy enough to work." He looked at Zetara. "I'm going to need you to trust me." She met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I already do." He changed their course, banking the Betsy hard toward the binary system. On the comm, a transmission request flashed. It was Jax. Rusty patched it through to the main screen. Kalen Jax's face appeared, crisp and clear. He looked calm, triumphant, a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "This is your final chance, Vance," he said, his voice smooth as polished obsidian. "Surrender the woman and the shard, and I might let you live out your pathetic days on some forgotten penal colony. Resist and your ship will be nothing but atoms drifting in the void. You know, for a guy with a fancy uniform, your threats are pretty unoriginal." Rusty shot back, his hands already inputting a complex series of maneuvers. "Tell you what, you want her? Come and get her." He cut the transmission, pushing the Betsy's engines to the breaking point. They roared into the Cathar system, the gravimetric shear from the 2 stars making the ship shudder and groan. "Zetara, I need you to get to the comm station in the cargo bay," he ordered, his eyes locked on the swirling chaos outside. "The long-range transmitter has a directional focus. When I give the signal, you need to broadcast the Ozemion shard's activation codes. Aim for the Starfire's last known coordinates. It's a long shot, but the pulsar's energy burst might just amplify the signal enough to reach them." "But the radiation," she started to protest. "The cargo bay's shielding won't hold." "It'll hold long enough," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Go, now." She hesitated for a split second, then nodded and disappeared from the cockpit. Rusty was alone with his ship and his plan. The Retribution followed them into the system, its superior speed allowing it to close the distance even further. Entering the pulsar's primary radiation field, Betsy announced, alarms beginning to scream throughout the cockpit. Hull temperature rising. Shields are failing. Rusty ignored the warnings. His timing had to be perfect. He watched the chronometer, his heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm in his chest. The pulsar was a terrifying spectacle, a celestial titan spinning with unimaginable speed, its energy beam a scythe of pure destruction. He flew the Betsy on a daring parabolic course, taking them perilously close to the pulsar's corona. Jax, blinded by arrogance, followed suit. Energy lances from the Retribution began to stitch across the Betsy's hull, each impact a jarring explosion of light and sound. "Come on, you bastard," Rusty whispered, his eyes glued to the countdown. A little closer. The timer hit 0. The pulsar's beam swept toward them. "Now, Zetara, transmit now," he yelled into the comm. At the last possible second, he threw the Betsy into a violent dive, dropping them below the plane of the beam's trajectory. The maneuver was brutal, the G-forces threatening to black him out. The ship screamed in protest, metal groaning under the impossible strain. The Retribution was too big, too confident, and too slow to react. Jax realized his mistake a fraction of a second too late. The pulsar's beam, a wave of incandescent energy, slammed into the Dominion destroyer. The ship's shields flared brilliantly for a microsecond before they were utterly overwhelmed. The beam sliced through the Retribution's hull as if it were paper, the sleek warship breaking apart in a silent, spectacular explosion of fire and twisted metal. For a moment, there was only the sound of the Betsy's groaning frame and Rusty's own ragged breathing. He had done it. He had won. But the victory was short-lived. His ship was dying. Consoles sparked and died. The lights flickered and the engines coughed and sputtered. They were adrift, bleeding power and atmosphere, dead in the water. He stumbled from the cockpit and made his way to the cargo bay. He found Zetara slumped over the comm station, the Ozimion shard still clutched in her hand. Its light now faded. The radiation shielding had been partially breached and she had taken a heavy dose. He knelt beside her, gently taking her in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, her skin cold. "Did it work?" she whispered, her eyes fluttering open. "Jax is gone," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. The fleet—" Before he could answer, a voice crackled over the ship's comm, cutting through the static. "Unidentified freighter. This is Captain Vorlag of the Viridian command ship Starfire. We received a fragmented transmission. A miracle. We are reading multiple life signs aboard your vessel. Do you require assistance?" A tear traced a path through the grime on Zetara's cheek. She smiled, a faint, weary smile of pure triumph. "We did it," she breathed. "Viridia is free." A short time later, the Betsy was bathed in the floodlights of the Starfire, a vessel of breathtaking beauty and power that had materialized from the void. Viridian medical teams came aboard, carefully transferring Zetara to their state-of-the-art medbay. Rusty stood on the bridge of the Starfire, looking out at the Viridian fleet, dozens of sleek, powerful warships that had appeared around them, a silent, avenging armada. He had been offered a clean bill of health, his own radiation exposure minimal thanks to the cockpit's heavier shielding. A few hours later, Zetara, now dressed in the regal silver and blue of her royal house, entered the bridge. She looked every bit the queen she was born to be, her strength and vitality already returning. The entire bridge crew snapped to attention, saluting her. She walked to Rusty, her expression a mixture of gratitude and a deeper, more complex emotion. "They are calling you a hero, Rusty Vance, the forastero who delivered the dawn." He gave a small, self-deprecating shrug. "I was just the driver. You were much more than that," she said, her voice soft. She stepped closer, her hand resting on his arm. "Stay, Rusty. Stay with me. A man of your honor, your courage. You would have a place of high esteem here. Viridia would be your home. I would be your home." The offer hung in the air between them, a promise of everything he had denied himself for so long. A home, a purpose, love. He looked into her eyes and saw a future he never thought possible, a future free from the ghosts of his past. He could stay. He could finally stop running. But as he looked at the disciplined crew, the pristine bridge, the powerful fleet, he knew he didn't belong. He was a man of the frontier, of rusty ships and dusty cantinas. He was a wanderer, defined not by a destination, but by the journey itself. His home was the road. His honor was his own, not something to be bestowed by a queen. He was the man who kept going. He gently took her hand from his arm, holding it for a moment. "Your people need their princess, Zetara," he said, his voice laced with a bittersweet ache. "And I have a promise to myself I still need to keep." He was a man who had broken a promise once and spent a lifetime running from it. Now, by helping her, he had finally kept one. He had drawn his line, stood his ground, and seen it through. And in doing so, he had found a kind of peace. But that peace belonged to the void, to the solitary cockpit of his ship, to the mournful sound of a blues guitar. She understood. The sorrow in her eyes was deep, but it was matched by a profound respect. "The galaxy will be a darker place without your light in it, Rusty Vance." "It'll be fine," he said with a charming, sad smile. "There are always more sad songs to listen to." After a final, lingering look, he turned and walked away, back to the airlock that connected to his battered old ship. The Viridians had already begun repairs on the Betsy. She would fly again. As he settled into his pilot's seat, the engines humming with a newfound stability, he looked at the Starfire one last time. He knew he was leaving behind a chance at happiness, at a life he might have had. But he was leaving as a man who was no longer running from his past, but as a man who had finally made peace with who he was. A lone forastero, the last of a dying breed. And as he guided the Betsy back into the lonely, star-dusted black, he turned on his music, and for the first time in a long, long time, he felt free. True honor is not found in titles or rewards, but in keeping promises, especially the ones we make to ourselves. Redemption is not about erasing the past, but about having the courage to face a new future, even if it means walking a lonely road. The road is long and lonely, but it's better when we travel together. If this story touched you, subscribe and share it with a friend who appreciates the old code of honor.